Hello and welcome to this virtual walking tour around St Paul's Cathedral, a London icon. My name is Caroline Piper and I'm a professional Blue Badge tourist guide in London. Sadly, the coronavirus pandemic has made it hard for many people to visit London and to take tours as they normally would. So I've been producing virtual tours instead. This short taster video is intended to give you an idea of how a virtual tour might work. If you were to book a virtual tour with me, it would be delivered live via Zoom. So depending on the size of the group, there could be plenty of space for questions, discussion and interaction. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you and let you see my St Paul's presentation so I can introduce you to this beautiful church. Here we go. I'm going to start with the opening slide and just ask you, if you don't mind, please do not photograph or record this virtual tour without my permission. So without further ado, let us begin the tour. Now, I thought it was important to begin by putting St Paul's Cathedral in its context so that you know where it is in London. So I'm just moving my cursor to over St Paul's Cathedral. If you look to the left-hand side of the screen, you can see bottom left-hand corner, two little green sections. Those are two green parks. Buckingham Palace, the home of the Queen, is nestled between them. To the right of the parks, you'll see a little bubble saying Big Ben, which is at the end of the Houses of Parliament. So that is Westminster, the political and royal heart of London. To the right of St Paul's Cathedral and down onto the riverside, where my cursor is, you'll see there is Tower Bridge, the famous bridge that opens in the middle. And next to that is the Tower of London. So Tower Bridge and the Tower of London are on one side of the historic City of London, the part of London founded 2,000 years ago by the Romans. And St Paul's Cathedral is on the other side, on the western side. Just going to play you this short video as we zoom in on St Paul's Cathedral so that you can see its surroundings. So St Paul's Cathedral on the western edge of the City of London. As you look at it, you'll see the Tower of London, and then imagine a semicircle going from the Tower of London around to and enclosing St Paul's Cathedral. That's the old City of London. St Paul's Cathedral is lined up with a beautiful bridge over the Thames called the Millennium Bridge, which is London's pedestrian-only bridge. And on the south side of the river, you have Shakespeare's Globe and the Tate Modern. Coming back up to St Paul's Cathedral now and zooming in, you get an aerial view of quite how huge it is, with the famous dome there in the middle. Now, St Paul's is London's cathedral and it's symbol of survival. It's a venue for important national occasions, and we'll talk about a few of those in a moment. It was founded all the way back in the year 604, and in fact today's cathedral is the fifth to have stood on the site. The previous four all burned down in fires, including the one before today's, known as Old St Paul's, which was the great medieval cathedral. Now, following the Great Fire of London in 1666, we just so happened to have in London arguably Britain's greatest ever architect, Sir Christopher Wren, and he rebuilt St Paul's Cathedral into the beautiful cathedral we see today. So we are now looking at the west front of the cathedral. That's the main flight of entrance steps that we as visitors would use if we're visiting as tourists or to attend services, and that important people also use when they come to visit St Paul's Cathedral. It was built by Sir Christopher Wren. The foundation stone was laid in 1675 and it was finished in 1711. So that was just 36 years, which is ridiculously fast to build such a huge building at the time. It really does make it unique compared to the earlier medieval cathedrals, which evolved over hundreds of years, because St Paul's was built by one architect in his lifetime, in one period of history, and in one architectural style, which is why it has the wonderful symmetry and uniformity that we get to enjoy today. Those two little western towers that we're looking at are topped with gold pineapples, which is a traditional symbol of hospitality and welcome. The one on the left houses the bells that ring the peal before services, and the one on the right houses two great big bells. Great Tom strikes the hours, and it can also be tolled on important occasions, such as the death of the monarch or the death of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And there's also a huge bell, more than 17 tons, called Great Paul, which traditionally tolled for 5 minutes before 1 o'clock. It was the lunchtime bell. You might recognise this view from the TV from famous national occasions, probably most famously the 1981 wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Her carriage arrived at the cathedral and she walked up that beautiful flight of steps to the great west doors in the centre with her long train flowing down those steps. More sadly, back in 1965, you might recall the coffin of our wartime Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, being carried up those steps for his funeral inside the cathedral. Successive monarchs have come to St Paul's Cathedral over the years to give thanks. It's where they tend to come to give thanks. And that included the Queen for her 90th birthday and for her Diamond Jubilee, for example. St Paul's is an Anglican Church of England church, and it is the seat of the Bishop of London, a lady called Dame Sarah Mullally, and she is the most senior female bishop in the Church of England. Now, at the front of the church, you can see we have a statue surrounded by black railings. I'm going to zoom in on that now. Now, this particularly beautiful photo was taken by William Tarvainen, who is a client on one of my walking tours last year, which happened to coincide with a wonderful sound and light event at St Paul's Cathedral, which was really special. In front, you can see Queen Anne. Now, her statue is there because she was queen when the cathedral was completed in 1711. She was our last Stuart queen. You might know a bit about her if you've watched the recent film The Favourite. Tragically, she had 17 pregnancies and none of her children survived infancy. She's surrounded by 4 statues at the base of her, the base of the plinth, which represent the kingdoms that Britain claimed to rule at the time. So Britannia, Ireland, France, and America. Now, this beautiful photo was also taken during the Sound and Light show held last year, when various beautiful poetry and photos were projected onto the west front of St Paul's Cathedral to celebrate those who had saved the cathedral during the Blitz, the German bombing campaign of World War II. So if you look to the left-hand side, the lady and gentleman on the left-hand side are our wartime monarchs. That's King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, known as the Queen Mum. They became very popular monarchs and won the loyalty of the British people for staying in London during the Blitz and visiting various bombed out areas of London. You'll then see a variety of other people, some wearing hard hats, etc. They are the rescue workers, firefighting services and air raid wardens who helped to keep St Paul's Cathedral safe. Now, Winston Churchill, our Prime Minister, had said St Paul's must survive at all costs. He was worried that if it was destroyed, morale would collapse. The reason it did survive was due to these firefighters and rescue workers, and in particular, a group of volunteers called the St Paul's Watch, a group of 30 to 40 individuals who stayed at St Paul's Cathedral every night as the bombs rained down, and they would extinguish the incendiary bombs designed to set things on fire. And St Paul's was especially vulnerable because its famous dome is actually made of a wooden timber frame. They went up on the outside of the cathedral, on the outside of the dome, in the blackout, armed only with buckets of sand into which they had to plunge the incendiaries. Now, St Paul's did take a couple of direct hits. There was a close call near the beginning in September 1940. I'm putting my cursor on the screen now near to where there's a sort of lamppost. Well, at the base of these west steps, a bomb landed, so powerful, it went 30 feet down into the ground, and then thank goodness the fuse failed and it didn't go off. So 2 very brave sappers who were awarded the George Cross for bravery and gallantry had to climb down and defuse that bomb and remove it from sight. They took it away to the east of London and blew it up in a controlled explosion. Later on, during the Blitz, a bomb would fall directly on the High Altar and also on the North Transept. But the most famous night was 29th of November 1940, when incendiaries rained down on the dome and London seemed to burn from end to end that night. And the famous image of the dome of St. Paul's unscathed amidst all the fire and the smoke the next morning became one of the enduring images of the Blitz, and one of the reasons why St. Paul's Cathedral is so important to Londoners. Now, this beautiful photograph captures a staircase called the geometric staircase. It's housed within one of those two front towers we were just looking at, the one on the right-hand side. And it leads up to Sir Christopher Wren, the architect's library. It's not open to the public because its structure is so fragile. We couldn't risk people walking up and down it. It's a geometric, self-supporting spiral staircase. And what that means is that you can look all the way up it, just like I have done for this photograph, and all the way down into the crypt as well. Its striking design means it's very popular with filmmakers, most notably the third Harry Potter film, The Prisoner of Azkaban, where this becomes a staircase at Hogwarts leading up to Professor Trelawney's divination classroom that you access via that trapdoor in the ceiling. I'm going to take you round to a view of the south front of the cathedral, incredibly classical in design. It looks rather like a Roman temple, and here you're seeing the dome peering out at the top. But I want you to zoom in at that image of a bird within a semicircle inside the triangular pediment. Now, that is a particularly beautiful and symbolic carving of a phoenix. Shows a phoenix rising from the flames. Phoenixes are symbolic of rebirth and renewal, and that is especially symbolic for St. Paul's Cathedral, which is seen as London's survivor church. It rose from the burned out ashes of old St. Paul's after the Great Fire of London, and then it endured during the World War II Blitz. The story goes that Christopher Wren was walking through the ruins of old St. Paul's, and he found a stone with the Latin phrase resurgam carved on it, and that means I will rise again, probably a reference from someone's gravestone to being resurrected to heaven. And Christopher Wren took that stone and placed it at the centre spot of his new dome, and then referenced it in this beautiful carving of the phoenix on the south side of the cathedral. And in the phoenix's claws is actually a little stone tablet on which is carved resurgam. Now, if you were to turn round from the south front of the cathedral, you would be looking at the Millennium Bridge. So imagine you've walked down on the beautiful, onto the beautiful Millennium Bridge. The photographed on the left-hand side is you looking back towards the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral and the south front. The photograph on the right-hand side shows the view from St. Paul's Cathedral, and you're looking over that beautiful steel suspension bridge, the Millennium Bridge, across the River Thames to the south side, where you have that large brick structure with a brick chimney, which is the Tate Modern Art Gallery. The Tate Modern is a museum of 20th century art housed in an old power station, Bankside Power Station. That was built in two phases mainly in the 1940s and 1950s, and it was designed by an architect called Giles Gilbert Scott, who also designed London's iconic red telephone box. The power station was closed down in 1981, and it was later brilliantly reconfigured as the Tate Modern Art Gallery, opening in the year 2000. Now, when Giles Gilbert Scott designed the Bankside Power Station, he designed it as a cathedral of power because of its position on the opposite side of the river to St. Paul's Cathedral. But he deliberately capped the tower a few feet shorter than St. Paul's Cathedral dome, because St. Paul's Cathedral was far more important. And you will notice that when the Millennium Bridge was built later on, the bridge is lined up dead straight with the dome, not with the tower of Tate Modern. Let's have a close-up look at that actual famous dome. The dome is considered Christopher Wren's masterpiece, and he had to fight to get it. Now, Wren had already been commissioned to rebuild and restore parts of old St Paul's before the Great Fire. After the fire, it was a brilliant new opportunity. He could start from scratch, and he famously said, "I build for eternity." I mean, what an ambition. Wren had to fight the cathedral clergy to get this dome because domes were seen as very Roman Catholic. So in fact, the design that was approved and signed by the king in 1675, called the Warrant design, actually says there will be a pointed steeple on the top of that dome. Today we see a much more architecturally appropriate stone lantern with a gold cross on top of it. And that is because the warrant the king gave Wren allowed him to make, and I quote, "some variations rather ornamental than essential, as from time to time he should see proper." Well, Christopher Wren took that loophole and ran with it and made sure we got the cathedral that he envisaged. The top of the lantern, that gold cross on the top of the lantern, is 365 feet above ground because Christopher Wren was an astronomer and he wanted the height in feet to be the same as the number of days in a year. The dome itself is ingenious. It's actually a triple dome. As we look at it from the outside, we're looking at a wooden structure covered in grey lead from Derbyshire, designed to be huge so it would dominate London and the skyline from miles around. If you look up at the dome inside, it's a much shallower painted dome made of brick covered in plaster and painted that's in proportion to the inside. And between the two, there is a brick cone that supports the white stone lantern perched on top of the dome. A really ingenious design solution. Let's have a close-up look at some of this beautiful carving. Now, St Paul's Cathedral is designed in what is called the English Baroque style, a style of architecture you see at the end of the 17th, early 18th centuries, and it's a more subdued version of the European Baroque. So you have classical forms. So for example, the window is a nice classical rounded arch. You've got lovely columns, and we were just looking at the west and south fronts, which have those sort of triangular pediments that look like the entrance to a classical temple. But the difference is it's not brightly coloured, there's no stained glass, it's not painted. Rather, the emphasis is all about the play of light on the surfaces and about carving to emphasise that and to emphasise the variations in the tonal colours of the stone. If you look at the bottom photograph, in the centre you've got a little bishop's mitre because this is the centre, the seat of the Bishop of London, and you've got the crossed swords and coat of arms underneath of the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral. Much more common is the sort of carving you see in the top photograph, those swags and garlands of fruits and flowers and lovely little cherub heads. Now, St Paul's Cathedral tends to play a very important part in great national events. So I took this photograph in 2018 during the 100th birthday celebrations for the Royal Air Force, the RAF, when there was a flypast of more than 100 planes from throughout the RAF's history across London and over Buckingham Palace, the home of the Queen. And of course, one of the best places to spot the aircraft was over the dome of St Paul's Cathedral. St Paul's Cathedral does have strong links with the military. Most importantly, it hosted the funerals of two of our great military heroes from the Napoleonic Wars, Admiral Nelson, who was in charge of the Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar, and the Duke of Wellington, who was in charge of the army at the Battle of Waterloo. They both had their funerals here, and they are both buried in the crypt. Continuing round, we're coming to one of my favourite views of St Paul's Cathedral. This is from the East End, taken from within a building called One New Change, a large modern building that combines shops and restaurants and offices adjacent to the East End of St Paul's Cathedral. It was designed by a French architect called Jean Nouvel and finished in the year 2010. And it has these wonderful floor-to-ceiling glass panels which let all this light flood into the building. And they also create these fantastic reflections, as you can see here, where we have almost 3 versions of St Paul's Cathedral. Now, when Jean Nouvel was coming up with his designs, he had to meet 2 key criteria. He had to open up previous public spaces on the site that had been lost by insensitive building over the subsequent years. And for example, he opened up the pathway from which I'm taking this photograph. The second criterion, which was most important, was that he maintained the viewing corridors to the dome of St Paul's Cathedral. And as you can see, he's done that brilliantly here. And that is one of the reasons why the building is capped at just 8 stories high. And it has on the top floor a free, publicly accessible roof terrace where you can go up and admire views of that dome. St Paul's Cathedral sits at the centre of a web of viewing corridors that radiate out from the dome like the spokes of a wheel. And this goes all the way back to the 1930s, when the surveyor, the architect of St Paul's Cathedral in charge of looking after the building, came up with a gentleman's agreement with the City of London Corporation, where the cathedral is based, to make sure that one should always be able to see the dome of St Paul's Cathedral down dedicated viewing corridors from famous spots such as a hill in Richmond Park, all the way over in the southwest of London, from Primrose Hill in the north of London, along Fleet Street to the west of St Paul's Cathedral as you approach along Fleet Street. And that became statutory planning law in the 1980s. And these viewing corridors have shaped the location and the layout of recent skyscrapers built in the City of London. This photograph also gives you a very good view of the American Memorial Chapel, which is at the far east end of the cathedral. It's in that little semicircular apse closest to us, sticking out from the cathedral. Now, the American Memorial Chapel is directly behind the high altar, which took a direct hit during the Blitz. So during the post-war reconstruction, the opportunity was taken to create a chapel specifically in memory of the American servicemen who were killed either on their way to or stationed in Britain during World War II. So, for example, that would include those based in Britain who died in the D-Day landings. And there's more than 28,000 names recorded in the Roll of Honour within the American Memorial Chapel. The chapel was paid for by voluntary subscriptions from the British people in recognition of the debt of honour they felt at the time that they owed to those American servicemen. And the chapel is beautifully decorated with carvings and pictures of American birds, animals, and the symbols of the 48 states that existed at the time are in the stained glass windows. So I'm going to give you an overview of where we've walked so far. So we started off at the west end. So where my cursor is, you see the 2 towers at the west front of the cathedral with the grand flight of steps from which you enter the cathedral. And we walked anti-clockwise around the side to where my cursor is now, the south front, where we admired the beautiful Phoenix and the views along the Millennium Bridge. And then we continued all the way round, looking up at the dome, seeing some of the carving, to the east end, where the American Memorial Chapel is. And indeed, we could stand over on the far right-hand side of this photograph is the roof of One Year Change, where you can get those fantastic views. When he died, Sir Christopher Wren asked to be buried in St Paul's Cathedral. He's buried in the crypt. On the wall next to his tomb, there is an epitaph composed by his son, and it says, "Reader, if you seek his monument, look about you." I hope you agree that no man could hope for a more beautiful memorial than St Paul's Cathedral itself. Now, St Paul's Cathedral is such an iconic London landmark that it's frequently used in films and TV. And that's something I discuss in more detail in my London on Film walking tour, but I had to discuss just a few examples with you here. So over on the far left-hand side you have a little version of a snow globe with St Paul's Cathedral inside. And this is taken from the 1964 musical Mary Poppins, starring Julie Andrews. In the film, we see Mary Poppins singing the song Feed the Birds. She's trying to get the two little Banks children to go to sleep. And she shakes the snow globe containing St Paul's Cathedral and all the pigeons, and the film travels into the snow globe to see the bird woman, the subject of the song, sitting on the west steps surrounded by pigeons. Now, of course, it wasn't actually filmed at St Paul's Cathedral. I'm sorry to disappoint you. It was filmed at the Walt Disney Studios in Los Angeles. On the right-hand side, you have a classic image from the British TV show Doctor Who. It celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2013, and it is the longest running sci-fi show in the world. Now, these tin robots are called Cybermen, and the Doctor has been battling the Cybermen ever since his first incarnation. They were originally humans who, over time, replaced their flesh with metal and plastic. And as they do so, they lose all their kindness and their joy and all other emotions. And the Cybermen have tried to invade London numerous times, twice from St Paul's Cathedral. So this image is taken from the 1968 episode when they emerge from the sewers and then walk down these steps leading to what would today be the Millennium Bridge. And you've got that wonderful view of St Paul's Cathedral in the background. In 2014, they again made St Paul's Cathedral their headquarters, and they in fact marched out of the Great West doors and down the Great West steps to try and invade London. And then lastly, I have a 50p coin minted by the Royal Mint in 2019 to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Paddington Bear books. The same year, the author, Michael Bond, wrote a special news story for the 60th anniversary, where Paddington goes to visit St Paul's with Mr Gruber, his friend, and accidentally ends up in the cathedral choir. And of course, this is also referencing the wonderful film Paddington 2, where the villain, Phoenix Buchanan, as played by Hugh Grant, breaks into St Paul's Cathedral in disguise in order to find one of these clues in his pop-up book that he's following in order to find a mysterious treasure. So I hope you have enjoyed this taster virtual walking tour around St Paul's Cathedral. It's a truly iconic London landmark, and if you want to know any more about St Paul's or about the City of London, I would be delighted to give you a virtual tour. Thank you so much for your company today. And I will stop sharing. There we go, and I will say my goodbyes. Thank you. Bye-bye.